Okay, I guess we'll just go ahead and get started then, and people can join as they come in. But today's session, I'm going to be going through a spouse client file from start to finish, just to give you a sense of how you would use eState to go through that kind of client file. And it's going to be really open-ended, so if you have any questions, you can just unmute yourself and jump in, or you can send it through the Zoom chat if that's easier. So hopefully everyone can see my screen right now. This is the main screen you get to when you first log into the system, and it's going to list all the clients that you've added in. So to start, to add a new client, you just go to this add button. Maybe let's just refresh this here. Okay, go to the add button, and then the key details are going to be first name, last name. So we're going to call this guy Ben Collins. The middle name field, if you have it, you can put it in as well, but it's not required. And then if you're choosing to send the client the online questionnaire, you're going to put in their email, and then you're going to click this use questionnaire box. And then when you add them to the system, it sends them off an email. The email basically says, click here to access your questionnaire. So they click on that link, they're brought to a page that has them create a password, just so that their information stays secure and so that they don't have to do the entire questionnaire in one sitting. They can come back to it at any time. And then they just go through it. So they put in their profile, family tree, asset, and debt information. And anything they put in that online questionnaire will automatically be populated back into your system. So they don't have to send anything back or anything like that. They just fill it out and it automatically puts that information in on your end as well. And then it's great because you have all of the information. It kind of avoids a lot of the time of manual entry. But we all know that some clients aren't as tech savvy and maybe the questionnaire online is not for them. So you can still use whatever your system is now. If you send them a PDF, if you send them a Word document questionnaire instead and have them fill it out and send it back, then you just don't click that use questionnaire box. You don't need to put an email, and then you can just do the manual entry yourself like we're going to do today. So let's go ahead and add Ben to the system. And now, since today we're doing spouse client, we're doing a spouse client file, you need to add both spouses to the system as separate client. So this is only if you're doing wills for both spouses, kind of like a mirror will situation. So if you're just doing one of the spouse's wills and the other spouse happens to be a beneficiary, you can just add them as a client and add that spouse to the family tree. But if you're doing wills for both of them, they need to both be separate clients. And then we'll link them together using this spouse client function. So you just go to this add button. We'll add in the name of the spouse, Lauren Collins, call her. And then this is the key field right here, this spouse client field. So you click it, it's going to list all the clients who aren't tied to anyone else in the system, and you just pick the spouse's name, so Ben Collins. And that way, when I add Lauren, they're going to be linked together. So you can only do this spouse client field when you're adding the second spouse to the system, because you need to add the first spouse in by themselves so that you have them as an option to choose here. So only on the second spouse. And then we'll go ahead and add. So now they're both in the system, and then we can go ahead and choose who we want to start with. So let's say today we're going to start with Ben. So click on Ben Collins, and then if the client had filled out the questionnaire, you would see whatever they put in. So you would see they built out an entire family tree, or if they hadn't put in anything, then you'd see just the client and the spouse because it's a spouse client file. So usually what I do first is I edit that client's information. And there's two ways you can do it. You can click edit and it will edit whoever the blue circle is around, or you can just double click on the icon that you want to edit and it's going to bring up more information. So the key things for anyone on the family tree, you're going to want to make sure first name, last name, and change the gender to whatever gender they identify as, just so that you're not getting that double wording he or she in the will. You can also put the middle name also known as, so if Ben's also known as Benny Collins, you can put that in here, and then in the will it will populate Ben, also known as Benny. Date of birth, you can pick it from this calendar or you can just type it in. I find that easier. So I just do month, day, year. So June 9th, let's say 1968. And then it'll populate that age automatically for you. You can pick a country, you can pick citizenship. All of this other information doesn't really affect the will, but it's good information to have on your client. So it's a lot of key data there. Residency is important because however you set the residency, the province specifically, is how the system knows to calculate the probate tax throughout. And if you're from Nova Scotia or BC, you're going to want to make sure the province is changed here so that it's going to generate a will in either Nova Scotia or BC precedent. So the default is supposed to be wherever you are from as the user. So I'm from Ontario, so that's my default. But if you're from any of those other provinces, you're going to want to change it to make sure that the right precedents are generating for you. City is also important. So if Ben is from the city of Toronto, it'll say Ben Collins from the city of Toronto in the will if you put that city in. Special circumstances for the client is a place where you can note any potential capacity issues. So you just click it off and you write a description in below. So it doesn't really affect the will itself, but again, good information to have on your file, especially if you suspect there might be a will challenge down the line on capacity. And then the last thing is direct relationships. So it's just going to tell you who they're tied to on the family tree. So right now, Ben is married to Lauren. That's the only other person on the family tree. So that's what it's telling us. So we'll go ahead and save this information. So next, let's say we wanted to add a child. So whoever the blue circle is around is who you're adding to. So you just click once on the icon to get the blue circle. If you double click, it'll bring up that more information. So in this case, let's say we're adding Ben's child. So we'll click once to make sure that blue circle's around Ben's icon. And then you go up to add and then child. And then it's going to ask you who the other parent to this child is. If it's Lauren, the current spouse, if it's a new parent, so an ex-spouse that's going to be involved in the will, or if there's a single parent. So either the ex-spouse isn't going to be involved in the will, so you don't need to add them to the family tree, or they're genuinely a single parent, then you can click that option. But let's say it's Lauren. And then again, the key fields, first name, last name, and gender. Date of birth, let's just put in 2000. And then if you scroll down to the special circumstances section, for anyone that's not the client, it's a place where you can note relationship difficulties, that kind of thing, which is good information to have if you suspect there might be a will challenge down the line. Good to have notes on that. But the key thing here is this disability function. So if the individual is disabled, you're going to want to make sure you click this off so that the system knows that they're disabled. And later on, if you're trying to set up a Henson trust, so fully discretionary to the death of the beneficiary, then it's going to recognize that because you gave it to a disabled beneficiary, you're trying to set up a Henson trust, and it will draft that wording accordingly. So make sure to mark the individual as disabled in this special circumstances section here. And then we'll just add. So if you look at your add list, you might notice there's no option for grandchildren or nieces and nephews, but there's still a way to get them on the family tree. So instead of just adding a grandchild directly to Ben, you have to add a child to Ben. Then you click on the child's icon and add a child to that child. Let's say he's a single parent. And that's how you'd get the grandchild's information in there. So we'll call her Lily Collins. We'll say she's a female. Let's say June is what I'm going with today. June 6th, 2018. And then same kind of thing for nieces and nephews. You would just click on Ben's icon or Lauren, depending on whose sibling it is, add a sibling to them, and then click on the sibling's icon and add a child to that sibling. So if there's going to be people involved in the will in either a beneficiary or a trustee capacity that don't fit on the family tree, either because they're really distant family or they're not family at all, You can add them over on this other tab here. So you just click add person, you put in their information, Jordy, Aiton, let's say he's going to be a trustee later on. We'll say he's a friend, and male, and then we'll add. So kind of the idea behind the people tab is you really want to get everybody's information in the system who's going to be a part of the will. So you don't need to make a giant family tree or anything like that to sort of show the family history. It's more that you're getting everybody's names and info in that is going to be in part of the will in either a beneficiary or a trustee capacity. So that's sort of the people tab. But does anyone have any questions so far? Nope. Okay. We'll keep going then. So that's people. Then we'll go to assets. So the assets tab can work in different ways depending on your client and what you're trying to do. So you're always going to start with those general personal effects assets, just to remind you to gift them to someone in the will. You can value it if you want. It's more really of just a placeholder so that you're gifting it to trigger that special general personal effects clause. But for any other assets, if it's like a high net worth client, you could add in all of their assets with all the values and sort of give them a sense of the net value of the estate, what's going where, that kind of thing. But if it's a really simple client, not too many assets, really just dealing with residue, then you don't have to add in every single asset that they have here. We can just kind of divide up the residue in the scenarios. But what you do have to add here are assets that are going to be specific bequests in the will or registered assets if you want those confirmed or to do a new designation in the will. So you have to add them in here as assets in order to later on be able to gift them or to do a new designation. So let's add a couple in. We'll go to add, start with a bank account. So basically you have your types or your categories and then your specific types within a category. And then we'll select. And really the key field here is this asset name field. So everything else, details, financial institution, that's just for the profile summary. So you have more in-depth information on the asset. But for the will, this asset name field is what counts, because if you do end up gifting it specifically, this is how it's going to be referred to in the will, whatever you put as the asset name. And also it's going to be how it's referred to throughout the system. So if you're adding in like 5 bank accounts and they're all called bank account, that can kind of get confusing. So I just put in all the identifying information here. So RBC bank account, whatever the account number is. So that way I know which asset this is. You don't have to put in a balance, but you can. If you do, you're going to notice that that probate tax is calculated automatically for you based on Ontario law for me, because that's what I set the client's residency as. But if you're from another province, then it will calculate it according to whatever province you've set the client's residency as. And let's say it's solely owned. So we'll just go ahead and add that in. Next, let's say we're going to do a home. So let's say select. Again, maybe they have a lot of homes. So this one's the family home. However you want that asset name, that's how it's going to be referred to. The address field will also populate. So if you're doing a specific bequest of the home, then this address field will populate in the will as well. Let's put a current value in. Let's say it's $1 million. So the probate tax calculates for you automatically. You've also got this mortgage/encumbrances field. And if the property has a mortgage on it, I would put whatever the value of the mortgage is on in this field here, because not only is it good to know what sort of asset this debt is associated with, but it has an effect on how much probate tax is calculated. So you also do have the option to add in a debt when we get to the debt section. You can add the mortgage in there. But if it's associated with a specific asset that you're adding to the system, I would put it in this field instead. Just make sure you're not adding it in twice. So don't put it in as a value here and add it as a mortgage in the debt section, because then it will double count it. So usually best practice, I just say add it in here. And then we'll go ahead and, let's say actually we're going to change the ownership. So I just click back on the asset and then I could make any edits to it. So I'm going to change it from sole to joint. And then just remember to scroll down a little bit more so you get this line so you can put the other joint owner in. So don't press this little person plus button because this is if you haven't added them to the system yet, which I just avoid anyway. I would go back and put them in the people section and then come back here. But if you just click right on this add owner text, it's going to bring up everyone you've added to the system on the people or the other tab. Then you can pick who the joint owner is, say it's Lauren, and then we'll save. And now because they're linked as spouses, if we were to switch over to Lauren's profile, which you can do by clicking on the name in the top corner and you switch over to Lauren, then here you're going to see right here this family home. So because we added it into Ben and marked it as joint with Lauren, and because they're linked together in the system, you're going to see this family home asset in Lauren's profile as well. So we don't have to add it in again. So let's go back over to Ben. We'll do one more. We're going to put in a RRSP. So we'll click here, select. Again, that asset name is going to be key. So I'm going to call it the RBC RRSP, whatever the account number is. This beneficiary field, this is just here if you want to put whoever the current beneficiary is on the policy. So it's just for information purposes right now. It won't actually have any effect in the program. It's just so that in that profile summary, you know whoever the current beneficiary is for information purposes. Later on, we're going to be able to designate a new beneficiary or confirm this beneficiary and choose whether or not we want that to populate in the will. Let's say the current value is 100,000. So you notice all the way along the probate tax calculates, but that income tax doesn't. And that's just because due to the variability of different clients' tax brackets, it's kind of hard to estimate. So what we usually do, just for estimation purposes, at the highest possible that they could incur, if it was something like a capital gain, an asset with a capital gain, we would do like 25% of that gain. Or if it was something like an RSP, I'd put in 50% of that, just so you're showing the client sort of what they could potentially be looking at, because it's a rough estimate anyway, since asset values are going to change over time, and so will the tax. So then we'll go ahead and add this in. So that's sort of how assets work. Any questions about assets? No. Okay, we'll keep going. So the next is debts. So this is more, again, for a planning purpose. It doesn't really affect the will. You just add debt. I would avoid the mortgage since we already did it. We'll just go over to, say they have a credit card debt, put in the balance and add. That's how that works. Then we'll get to scenarios. So this is really where all of the main planning occurs. And the idea is at most, you plan for each of these three scenarios so that you're covering your bases no matter what ultimately ends up happening to the client. So you start with surviving spouse and you create the plan for if the spouse is still alive when the client's passed. Then you go to descendants only, and this is the plan for if the spouse and the client are gone, but there's still kids or grandkids around. And then you go to no descendants. This is like your ultimate disaster. You don't necessarily always get to plan this far, especially if you've got a big family with lots of kids and grandkids, but you could plan for this scenario. So this is ultimate disaster. What happens if everyone was kind of wiped out? What's going on with the estate? So you would ideally start with this one. So you'd click on surviving spouse and you would plan for this. But what I'm going to show you today is how you would use Eplans. So this is if you're dealing with a typical situation. Instead of going through and planning sort of manually starting from scratch, what I would do is go up to this little lightning bolt button. And then you're going to have these things called Eplans, which basically is like a giant macro that goes through the system and plans for the scenarios and the appointments according to whichever one you choose. So even if none of these meet exactly what you're trying to do, I would still take a look at them to see if anything kind of matches, especially because in that surviving spouse scenario, often it's going to be a pretty similar plan unless you're getting into spousal trusts and stuff. But at the least, it'll give you a starting point. So you can run this e-plan and then you can take everything out, or you could just not run it and start from scratch. But if you're like, okay, this is kind of what I want to do, this spouse with younger children to distributions trust, which is telling us in a surviving spouse, it's going to give everything to the spouse. In the second scenario, it's going to give everything to a children in a trust, and then no descendants, it's giving half to siblings, half to spouses' siblings, which is like kind of what I want to do. Maybe I want to change the ages in the trust, but this is kind of the basic idea I want to follow. So I'm going to run this, and then we can go into each scenario and make any changes that we want. So it's just a good starting point so you're not starting from scratch. So I'm going to execute. And now when I go into this, it's not going to be blank. So I can see already that the balance of the estate is divided up. But we'll look here first, this joint designated assets. So what it's done is it's looked at all the assets that I've added to the system, brought those joint assets to anyone it was joint with, and it's also giving the registered assets right to the spouse, just with the e-plan. So this looks good. This is falling outside of the estate. The e-plan's done it for me. Then for initial gifts, for the general personal effects, it's given it to the spouse as well, which is exactly what I would want to do, because you want to make sure those general personal effects are gifted specifically in order to trigger that special general personal effects clause. So let's say I'm just going to show you how you do it manually. If you didn't run the e-plan, you just drag and drop it from your assets list over there. You'd click on that beneficiaries line and pick the spouse's name, and then you would just add. So it's there. Anything that's left over here as an asset automatically falls into the balance. So you don't need to drag and drop it anywhere. And because we ran that e-plan, it already did it for us. So we can see the details by clicking on those gray bars. And it's telling us it's an absolute gift to Lauren, who's the spouse, 100%. We didn't put a gift over in because the gift over is that next scenario anyway. So you don't need to put anything in here. So this is good. This surviving spouse scenario is what I would typically want to do. So I don't need to really make any changes here. Then we'll go descendants only. So probably not any joint designated assets. So we'll just go to initial gifts, and it's gifted the general personal effects to the class of children, which is good because that triggers that special clause again in the to the children specifically instead of the spouse. So I'm going to click on it. If you wanted, you could name the children specifically instead, but to use the class, just scroll down this list and it's going to give you a bunch of class options. So I can pick the class of children. Later on, I can decide whether I want to leave that class open to future children or not on the provisions tab. And then lastly, the residue for this scenario. So let's see the details. So to see it, I just click on that gray bar and click on it again. And it's got it going to the children for 100%. The duration is when the beneficiary reaches age 30. Let's say I wanted to change that. All I do is click on it, put in a different age and say done. And then it's telling me it has staged lump sums. So it says 50% at age 25, but I'm going to change it to at age 21, 25% instead. So now I have a trust for the children to age 25 with a distribution of 25% at 21. And then it's got a gift over in from the e-plan, first to beneficiaries issue, so the children's kids. And if they don't have issue, then to the other class members, so the other children. So this looks good. So I can just save that. And then because I made a change to this scenario, let's say I want that Lauren's going to want that change reflected in her will as well. So I'm going to use this little sync button up in the top corner, and it's basically going to copy everything in the descendants only scenario over to Lauren's profile. So I just click sync, and then it's going to copy the plan with the changes I've made for this scenario over to her as well. Then lastly, no descendants. So because we ran that e-plan, it's got half going to siblings, half going to spouses' siblings. But let's say I didn't want this scenario at all I would do is press clear. So then I could just leave it at that and keep going. But let's say I did want to plan for this ultimate disaster, but none of these it's not a common scenario. So it's not going to be a macro because these are just really common scenarios for the residue breakdown. So instead, I'm going to do it manually by adding a segment and adding gifts within the segment. So that's how you can divide up the residue manually. Let's say I wanted to leave half to Jordy and half to a charity. So I'd start by creating my first segment for 50% since I want to deal with half of it first. And then now that I've sort of divided it up, I've created this 50% piece, but I have to specify what's happening to it. And I do that by adding a gift. So then I can decide, is it absolute or trust? I'm going to say it's absolute. I'm going to click on that beneficiaries line and pick Jordy. Then this says 100%. And all that means it's 100% of the 50% segment. So I don't want to divide it up even further. So this is good. I don't want to change it to 50% or anything like that. It just means 100% of the 50%. And then let's say a gift over to his issue, and we'll add. So now I can see from the circle of this 50% of this outer circle, I've dealt with 100% of it. So I don't want to add any more gifts since I've already dealt with all of this 50%. I need to go back to the segments page, which is by clicking this grayed out segments over here. And then I can add my second segment for the other 50%. And then specify what I'm doing here. So if you've already added the charity to the system, you can scroll all the way to the bottom of this list and pick it. But if it's a new charity, just go to the 3 dots and then you can go new charity and just type it on the line. And if you have the ID number, just put it right on that name line. So that ID field doesn't actually do anything or populate anywhere, so just ignore it. Just put anything you need in the name line. And then we'll go ahead and add. And because we made changes to this one, we're going to want to sync it over to Lauren's as well. So the key thing to note about syncing is it'll copy everything over. So anything that's joint between the two of them, the residue breakdown, the only thing that it doesn't copy over is solely owned assets. And what the key thing to note there is it sees the general personal effects as each of their solely owned assets. So even if you sync it over, it's not necessarily going to copy that over. So sometimes you have to go into the other spouse's profile and then gift their general personal effects specifically. So that's kind of the one thing to note. So that's sort of scenarios. That's all the big planning stuff. And then we'll go to appointments. And because we ran that E-plan, it's going to have already put the spouse as the primary estate trustee. But let's just say we're starting from scratch here. All you do is click add. You click right on appointee and pick the spouse. And then for condition, in order to make them a primary, you're going to select none as the condition and then add. And then if you wanted to do another primary, you could do the same thing. They could be joint. If you wanted to put in an alternate, then you're going to put a condition on it. So let's pick Jordy. And for condition, we'll say, if all specified cannot act. That's the one that I usually use. And then just make sure whoever specified is the person that you're talking about. So Lauren. Say we wanted to do a further alternate, I do the same thing. I pick John. If all specified cannot act. If I wanted him to be a joint alternate with Jordy, I would keep the specified as Lauren. But if I wanted him to be an alternate to Jordy, I would change it to Jordy's name. So that way it's going to be Lauren if Lauren can't act, Jordy if Jordy can't act, John. And then the sync button for the appointments is actually in the bottom left down here. So you can just sync this over. Then we'll go to provisions. So for provisions, there's a couple of different things. The first is funeral arrangements. If you want those to populate, just type them on the line and it's going to come up as a body disposition clause in the will. If not, just delete this text and it won't come up at all. Include future members. This is what I was talking about earlier. So if you're using class gifts in the will, here's where you can decide whether or not you want future members of that class to be included. So basically it affects the definition. So if I did click that box, it would say the children are A and B and any other child born to me and Lauren kind of thing. But if I don't, then it'll just say the children are A and B. Class restrictions, same kind of thing. You can restrict certain members of being part of a class. Trust for beneficiaries under a certain age is a general trust clause, and it's going to sort of guide underage beneficiaries that haven't had specific trust set up for them. So we did that trust for children in the will, so it's not going to affect that, but maybe that ended up going to the grandchild through a gift over and they were underage and they didn't have a specific trust set up, it would follow this general clause. And the last thing is just secondary will asset. So it's just going to tell you here, you can pick and choose which definitions you want included in the secondary will. So this is if you're doing primary and secondary corporate asset. If you're just doing a single will, you can just disregard this part. You don't have to click or unclick anything. It just won't have any effect on it. So that's provisions. Then we're going to go up to this little exclamation point in a circle up in the top right. And these are what we call our advisor insights. And it's going to basically be a checklist based on what you put in the system that's helping to advise you on certain planning things. So here, for example, it's telling us Lauren doesn't have a gender specified. So some of them you can change. So if I went back to the people tab, I put in a gender for Lauren, I saved it, this would disappear off my advisor insights. But not everything goes away. Some of them are just for you to consider. So like the family home could potentially be a land titles qualified property, so that you would look into that information and then you'd be confident that you had looked into it. Then the next one is notes. So you can just make any notes on your client here. Maybe you would want to note, check the spelling of this person's name, or that you had done a title search on a property. Those are good things you could put in there. Then this last button, this is where you go and generate your documents and your summaries. So let's start with the summaries. These are just good for the client's understanding of the will and the estate plan. So the first one's the profile summary, and it's got all the information on the profile of the client, all the people on the family tree, the assets, and the debts. So it's great to have on your file because it's all of the information, everything that they would have filled out in their questionnaire. And it can also be good to give to the client after that meeting to make sure that all the name spellings are correct, all the asset details are correct, that kind of thing. The second one is the graphic scenario summary. So it's going to give you a nice visual. So if you're putting in all those assets and the values, it's really useful because it shows you sort of the net value of the estate, what's going where, that kind of thing. So it's a nice visual representation of the will plan. And then the last one is the text scenario summary. So this is basically all the information in the will. So who the trustees are, how you've broken down each scenario, what gifts you created, and it's almost like the will without the legalese. So it's just kind of a more digestible format of the estate plan for the client because it's just set out sort of specifically and not kind of buried in legalese. So those are the summaries. Then you get to the actual documents. So you just go back to that little downward arrow, documents. If you're on a trial, you can just disregard it, but it's just telling you that this is when you would incur the fee for the client. Then you look at your list and we're going to pick single will. The signing date, you could change it to a different date. You could take it out, depends on what you want to do. Registered asset designation, here's this little box. This is where we're going to decide if we want to either confirm or to do a new designation for those assets in the will. So then you would make sure this box is checked off. If not, you would just uncheck it. Joint designated asset confirmation. This is if you have a client that's got a lot of joint assets with adult children. Here, you just make sure that anything that's joint is truly intended to be joint and not just held on a resulting trust. Counterpart is if you're signing in counterpart under the new legislation. Simplified provisions is a shorter will with less definitions and powers. The will guide is a nice little guide to the clauses at the end of the will, and a cover page is just a cover page. And then you would click on your little generate button, and basically it would spit out a will. It's a Word document, so you can make any changes that you want. Here's the cover page, it's got that information on it. Then you start with the funds and plans, so that's because we checked off that registered asset box. Assets passing outside of the will, this is because we clicked the joint asset box. Definitions, here because we did future children, it's saying my children means John Collins and any other child born to, because we clicked that on the provisions tab. Here are executors, so we've got Lauren, if not Lauren, then Jordy. Disposition of body, so that's because we put in the funeral arrangement on the provisions tab. Here's the personal effects, so we put it to Lauren. This is an older one, so it would have given to the children. Sometimes if you gift the personal effects to the children, you're going to see red highlighting come up, and that's just because it wants to know how you want those personal effects divided up, whether you want to leave it to the trustee's discretion or implement some sort of lottery system. The residue, so this is how you're dividing up the residue. So first to Lauren, then if not to Lauren, we did this trust for the children, and then ultimately half to Jordy, half to Epilepsy Toronto. And I'm just going to scroll all the way to the bottom, and then here you got your nice little will guide with all of the list of the clauses, and it'll correspond to the different parts of the will so the client can have a better understanding. So that's how you do it. Then you'd go back to the other client. So you'd switch over to Lauren's profile. Oops, I might have logged myself out, but you'd switch over to Lauren's, and then you would go and generate her documents as well. I'd go through the scenarios to make sure you didn't need to make any changes, and then I'd go up to documents and generate her single will. And one thing I want to note before we wrap up is this little question mark button up in the top corner. So if you click on it, it's going to bring you right to our help desk, and it's got lots of articles on how to do certain things. Maybe you're like, how do I do a Henson Trust? First, you got to make sure you mark that disability off on the People tab. Then you can go and create the gift and make sure it has these properties, and then it will generate the trust. So it can be a really great resource if you're stuck on anything, but of course you can always email me as well, and I'm happy to jump on a Zoom and walk you through it. So does anyone have any questions before we wrap everything up? Nope. Okay, well, if you do come across anything later, don't hesitate to reach out, but thanks again for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.